Okay, hello everyone, welcome to this event today, Working Women Past and Present, which is hosted today by Layers of London and Newington Green Meeting House in partnership. And we're going to hear from a panel of activists and historians today discussing their work and the theme of workplace equality. So I'll pass you all over to Amy Todd, who's the Community and Learning Manager at Newington Green Meeting House in a moment, but just to let you all know how this works is that none of the attendees, you won't need your cameras today, but you can still interact by using the chat box. Some of you might have heard Anitha just speaking there about it. If you have any comments throughout the presentations or questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and then we will have a questions and answers bit at the end, so we'll address all the questions. And also, if you want to speak your question, you can use the raise hand function, which is in the participants panel. If you click that on which is on the main menu at the bottom, you can use the raise hand, but save that till the end. So if you want to speak your question out loud, we'll unmute you and then you'll be able to talk. So yeah, I'll just pass you over to Amy now, who will do an introduction.
Great. If you allow me to share my screen, Liam, when you've got a minute. But my name's Amy and I'm from Newington Green Meeting House. So we're really lucky that Layers of London, which is a project of the Institute of Historical Research, is allowing us to do this. It's part of their webinar series, which has been very successful. And thank you everyone for joining us on the hottest day of the year so far. We're very grateful for your engagement to women's history, which is what we like to see. So we've got an amazing set of people here that are going to be talking about their work and their thoughts on the subject of women and work. And this comes from part of the work that the project that I work on, which is this one, which is Newington Green Meeting House. For those of you that might live in London or travel to London a lot, you might know the building kind of sits between Hackney and Islington. And this is the building here. It's a meeting house. It's the oldest place of nonconformist worship that's still in London. And today is home to New Unity, which is the non-religious church. And we've always been a bit different. And our history is follows English radicalism, nonconformism. You can see some pictures here of our history and some of the amazing people that have been involved in the building and that story's history, which includes, you can see here at the bottom, an image of Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of British feminism, who lived in Newington Green and built a school there and attended the meeting house, even though she was Church of England, because she was interested in this dissenting community that resided there. And so we're very grateful to have such an amazing woman as part of our heritage. And being a paid author, and as well as Enlightenment philosopher and all the other things, women and work, women's rights was a big important thing for Mary Wollstonecraft and is part of our heritage. And so out of that history, that's where this event comes today. And because of the amazing reception that we've got, we're very aware that the event today is only going to cover certain parts of the story when it comes to women and work, such a huge topic. And we're very aware that we're only going to scratch the surface today. But we're thinking, because of the engagement that we've got, we'd love to do another one, a Women and Work Past and Present too, perhaps, where we can hear from another range of speakers to get a full breadth of that history. Yes, so I'm going to introduce now our first speaker. Let me just stop sharing my screen. So I'm going to introduce you now to Helen, and Helen's going to tell us about her work in the field of women and work. Over to you, Helen. I think you're muted, Helen, sorry. There we go, great.
Right, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, Amy. I want to address the themes of tonight's event through a focus on mothers who worked for pay. And this is a subject of a book that I've recently published. I hope you don't mind the shameless plug. It's called Double Lives, A History of Working Motherhood, and it covers British history over the past century and a half. And I think that this subject of working motherhood is actually particularly germane for this discussion. and for thinking about historical legacies of feminism and activism around workplace equality. Because working mothers have occupied a rather ambiguous place in those struggles over the past century or so. If we look back at the 19th century history of feminism in Britain and to the mid-Victorian women's movement, we find a great deal of agitation around the rights of single women to enter a wider range of professions and to have access to training and education. And we find a great deal of campaigning around the rights of women within marriage in relation to owning property and to having equal custody of their children. And of course, there's the campaign for the vote. But in contrast to these causes, Victorian feminists were actually rather ambivalent about women working for pay beyond marriage and motherhood. Classic liberalism was a very important shaping influence for mid-Victorian feminists, and so they were generally opposed to laws which prevented women from deciding for themselves whether they were going to work or not, so laws such as marriage bars or laws limiting women's working hours in industry. But they also assumed that most women would, on marriage, retire from careers or withdraw from regular wage earning and instead become fully occupied with running their homes and looking after their families. And in truth, this is what the majority of women did in the late 19th and early 20th century. They became full-time housewives doing the very heavy and demanding work of washing, cleaning, cooking and provisioning for their families. And of course, the embodied work of pregnancy, childbirth and nursing. There were important exceptions to this rule, and I write about them in my book. So there were industries like cotton weaving or pottery making or jute, where it remained fairly common for wives and mothers to continue regular wage earning. And there were exceptional women in the professions who continued to follow careers as mothers. But for most married women, paid work was something to be done casually and intermittently as and when their families needed extra income. And these deeply gendered patterns of employment posed a problem for feminism, and not just for liberal feminists, and I'm thinking here of figures like Millicent Garrett Fawcett and Helen Blackburn, but also for Labour and socialist activists who wanted to improve the wages and status of women in industry. And here I'm thinking of figures like Clementina Black and Mary MacArthur, who were very active in organising women into trade unions. But those Labour and socialist activists, again, tended to prioritise the interests of single women who had to earn their own living while they were in the workforce, but most of whom, again, it was assumed, would subsequently become housewives and mothers and would at that point become largely dependent on the wages of a male breadwinner. And the economic dependence of the working class housewife became a central problem for early 20th century feminists who debated different solutions, of which regular wage earning, working motherhood, was only one. So far more prominent in this early 20th century debate was actually the so-called endowment of motherhood, what would later be known as family allowances and later on renamed child benefit. Its most prominent advocate, the feminist and later MP Eleanor Rathbone, argued that the service performed by women to the community in the rearing of the next generation was criminally undervalued, and that it was unacceptable for mothers to be reliant economically on whatever their husbands decided to give them from their weekly wage packet. So a taxpayer-funded cash benefit paid directly to mothers to remunerate them for their domestic labour and to give them some financial autonomy in the family was Rathbone's preferred solution to the problem of women's economic dependence, not wage earning continuously beyond marriage and motherhood. And of course, the valuing of women's domestic labour resurfaces again in very important ways in the women's movement in the 1970s. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I think it's really important to remember that feminists historically have never spoken with one voice on the question of workplace equality. They've not agreed that paid work in the capitalist economy or the pursuit of continuous full-time careers is emancipatory for all women at all times. they've been very divided historically over the particular issue of mothers in the workplace, because early 20th century feminism actually had a very strong maternalist streak within it. And I have to say at times, eugenicist streak in it as well. If you look at some of the rhetoric around the falling birth rate, anxieties about mothers' bodies in the workplace, and so on. And I think a century on, if we look back and we consider the legacy of these earlier struggles, and perhaps want to turn to those earlier struggles for inspiration, we mustn't turn away from these tensions or try to flatten out these complexities. And I think actually by engaging with them, we can learn two important lessons from history. And this is my final concluding thoughts. One of which is that women are not all the same. And see the world differently. Even if there are fundamental sexual divisions in operation, women experience them differently and make sense of them differently. And the second lesson is that feminism has not always done a brilliant job at capturing that diversity of experience and outlook. Like all political movements, it's privileged some voices and perspectives over others at different moments in time. And I think this is as true of second wave feminism as it is of first wave feminism. But I cannot think of any better corrective to this than studying women's history in all its richness and plurality, and in all the ways in which it can surprise us and make us catch our breath and make us think again, as well as the ways in which it can inspire us and provide a sense of solidarity and sisterhood over time. So I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I will also shamelessly plug Helen's book, Double Lives, which inspired this event. If I'm honest, I saw that it was released recently, wasn't it, Helen? And thought, wow, fascinating, and read it, and was in part which inspired this event. So thank you. And I you know, especially I think what Helen mentioned there about how women's bodies has been thought about, and legislation that has been put in place when it comes to how people think about motherhood and what the role of a mother is and how work can interrupt that. It was fascinating. I like to think I'm a fairly active reader, and I learned a lot from that book. So thank you, Helen. So now I'm going to pass over to Anitha. And Anitha, I don't know, I will just mute myself now and I will let you speak. So thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for turning up here today when it's such a bright and sunny day. So good choice, hopefully. I want to talk today about a strike that has, over the last 10 years, I think, has increasingly come into public view. It's the Grunwick dispute, which took place in 1976, 76 to 78. And it's a dispute that I did some research on with Professor Ruth Pearson, and I'm also going to flash a book like Helen. It's a book, it's a dispute that we've written a book about called Striking Women. And I'll start with why we did that research. It was because there's a stereotype of Asian women, which you can see in media, of Asian women as docile, as passive, confined to the domestic sphere, or as hyper-visible as victims of patriarchy, or sometimes as helpmates of terrorists. So there's this whole construction of Asian women, and we felt very uncomfortable with this dominant stereotypes of Asian women, and felt that though employment records show that certain categories of Asian women, for example, Punjabi women, have a high participation in the labor market in the UK, their voice and image as workers is completely absent from the public discourse. And so we wanted to put a counterpoint to that dominant construction of South Asian women. At the same time, we also wanted to tell a different story about British labor history. And we felt this story was one which, where voices and struggles of migrant and minority workers were underrepresented. So that's why we did this research. And quickly about Grunwick dispute. So Greenwich dispute started in 1976, and it was a factory, a photo processing plant in North London. And these were the days when people took a holiday, foreign holidays had just started in the late 60s, and people would take pictures and post them, and then it would be processed by the factory and it would come back. And so Greenwich processed photographs, and over a period of time, through the late 60s, early 70s, the workplace at the factory changed from predominantly white workers, often of Irish descent, to Black and minority ethnic workers. And this was the period when South Asians were coming to the UK from Uganda and other countries in East Africa, and they held British passports, but following Africanization policies there, and they were expelled from Uganda, they came to the UK with British passports as citizens, but they found that the treatment that they received here was far from ideal. And so they were looking, and often they came with very little wealth, they were looking for jobs, for employment, to reclaim their middle class status, which is what they were in countries in Africa. And so gradually the workplace was replaced with Asian workers because, and predominantly women workers in certain sections of the factory, because these workers were constructed as ideal workers. And by that term, ideal workers, we mean workers who will work hard, but who are docile and who are constrained by that socioeconomic position, and therefore less able to leave the labor market, less able to leave the factory because of discrimination or adverse treatment. And that was the situation in that factory. The pay was far less than other photo processing plants, but what was the key issue wasn't just pay, was the way they were treated. So the workers were expected, the women workers were expected to stay back at very short notice. So at 7 o'clock, they'd be told they need to stay back till 9, 10 for overtime. And for women, we all know that women do a second shift. Women don't just do paid work, they come back and do cooking, cleaning. And so it was very difficult for women to negotiate that. And also there was humiliation, ritual humiliation. Women would be told off in front of other workers. They would be, they'd have to raise their hands to go to the toilet, which some of them felt embarrassed to do. And so there's this whole set of conditions because of which they felt very aggrieved. So one day, Jayaben Desai, who worked there, as she was preparing to go home, she was told that she'd have to stay back for overtime. And she was unhappy because earlier that day, her son, who was also working in the factory just in the summer as a temporary worker, was on the production line. He was laughing with a fellow student. They were students, and so they had temporary jobs. And the factory manager turned to them and said, "Stop chattering like monkeys. This is not a zoo." And we all know what the term monkeys means when it's for Black and minority ethnic people. So she was already upset by that. So in the evening when she said, I'm not accepting the overtime, and there was an altercation, and the manager called her to this glass cabin he had where he'd tell off workers in front of everyone else, and there was a big row, and she turned to the manager and said, "Listen, Mr. Manager, what you're running here is not a factory, it is a zoo, and in a zoo you have many different types of animals. You have monkeys who dance to your tune, but you also have lions who can bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager." And she walked off. And as she walked off, she told the other workers, he wouldn't treat white workers the way he treats us. And following that, other workers joined, and there was this big dispute that was set up. For the first few months, it was very quiet, and then they mobilized, and the trade union movement responded. And in the summer of 77, 20,000 workers turned up on the packed streets of London in support of these workers. So the dispute went for a long time. I won't go through the ups and downs of it. Ultimately, it ended in defeat. But we remember that dispute today as a turning point, though, I mean, in our book, we argue it wasn't quite a turning point. These things take a lot longer. But it's celebrated as this moment when the working class in Britain, for the first time, acknowledged the cause of migrant and women workers. Because before this time, there had been a long and sad history in the British trade union movement where workers were pitted against other workers, where Black workers were paid less than white workers, women workers were paid less than men workers. So as Asian women, they were disadvantaged on both those counts. And when these workers, there were other strikes by Asian women before, when they went on strike for their rights, they had to fight not just the management, they also had to fight the trade union and their fellow workers who would not stand by them. And so this was history in Britain. And this was the first time that white workers found common cause with South Asian women workers. And that's why I think it's really important to remember this moment. What's possible when workers come together. And this was the beginning of a long shift in trade unions. And that process is still ongoing, of acknowledging the issues and the needs of Black and minority ethnic workers. I'll stop there. And then maybe with questions, I can talk a little bit more.
Yes, that's wonderful. And thank you, Anitha. And can you show us your book again so that when people want to read some more that they can, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure, I have a website as well, but I don't know how to share screen, so.
Well, if you, you could put it in the chat and then people can go and, yeah, or you could send it to Liam. That would be great. Thank you. So next we're going to hear from Sadie, and Sadie is an archaeologist who works for MOLA.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am going to try and share my screen, so we'll give it a go. There we go. Okay. So yes, I'm going to be talking about my profession of archaeology today, which is an inherently political occupation, obviously, given that we produce representations and interpretations of the past. Gendered archaeology, both in terms of practice and interpretation, has been and still is a big problem. So I'm going to outline broad development of the profession, really. I haven't got long, so talk about the current situation, challenges that women might face, and then move on to a positive bit at the end. Archaeologists are often seen, especially if you watch TV, as middle-aged chaps wearing fluffy jumpers with beards. And that is partly true, I have to say. But of course, it's far more complex than that. And we have really impressive early pioneering female archaeologists, such as Dorothy Garrett here. Dorothy studied at the time when there were very few women working in archaeology, the late 19th, early 20th century. There were some women, all of whom were fairly middle class, well-to-do ladies. Dorothy studied at Oxford and became the first female professor at Cambridge about 10 years before they actually allowed women to get degrees from Cambridge. So she was a true trailblazer. But the woman on the right in the photo with Dorothy is a woman called Yusra, who was Dorothy's lead supervisor on this very famous Mount Carmel site in Palestine in the 1930s. And I use these two images really as an example of how women have often skirted the discriminatory nature of our profession, and all professions actually, academia and fieldwork. Many were forced into admin roles or are actually more famous as being the wives of famous male archaeologists, in fact. But Dorothy was in charge, which is why she's a really useful pioneer, really an example for us today. And the networks that she set up and the fact that most of her team were women is why I've chosen her. Yusra, sadly, is lost to history. She had plans to go to Cambridge to study archaeology, but the Palestinian lands were depopulated after the Second World War, and no documentary trace of her has been found since these photos, sadly. But the networks that Dorothy set up and other female colleagues and friends of hers, all relating to archaeological excavations that they met and worked on together, friendships that were formed in university departments, presumably in bars and pubs, really echo the networks that women, I think, at work make today. And now we use things like Facebook Messenger to send ourselves positive messages, words of comfort or support, thumbs up emojis. And this is exactly the same thing, just in an earlier part of history, really. But now the world of archaeology that I work in is very different, and we are fully embedded due to planning law in the construction industry. Here we are working at the bottom of NatWest Tower on a site called Lion Plaza, digging the Roman city of London. And this, of course, means that we work on building sites, which comes with its own challenges. And it is true, and I use this slide mainly as a joke, but it's not really funny. The construction industry is an incredibly hostile environment for many women, particularly young women, particularly mothers. But nobody has an easy time of it, of course. Particularly the working hours are brutal. And quite often you'll find yourself the only woman in a room of 40 people, 40 men, making serious high-level decisions and trying to get your point across. And this kind of exclusionary or isolated nature of the work permeates all parts of the working day, including things like toilet provision and welfare, places to get changed. So this is a slide that I use all the time when I talk about archaeology. But you can see that the site leadership team, who are all male, have put the female changing room in the same room as the prayer facilities, effectively insulting all the minorities on the site in one fell swoop, really. And this isn't unusual, I have to say. There have been attempts to network and build relationships for women in construction in the industry itself, but they're all aimed at senior roles and managers and the more professional occupations, and they don't include the women who we more commonly meet on site. So cleaners, people that work, women that work in canteens, that kind of role, who are often women of colour and usually working class. And as archaeologists, we're really keen to avoid creating more exclusionary spaces, really. If you Google search female archaeologist or women in construction, you'll end up with Lara Croft, somebody wearing short shorts with a power tools. And we do wield power tools, of course. These photos, images are ones that go back to the 1970s with the lady with the trainers on, obviously pre-health and safety rules. But it's actually quite a physical job a lot of the time, and people find it quite shocking that women would be able to wield a shovel for a day and will be able to hold their own with male colleagues. But it's not actually all about the physical activity of digging, of course. It's about far more than that, and that's why it's a profession that you can enter whether you're a physically strong person or not. And actually, more importantly, in many ways, it is who is communicating the results of what we find. Archaeology, we have a professional and ethical obligation to communicate what we find to the wider public. And those narratives, and we'll talk about this, I suppose, in a bit later on, those narratives are hugely, at the moment, restricted in terms of who writes the books. So the books about Rome and London in the last 100 years, they've all been written by white people, and double the number have been written by men than women. We know that the gender pay gap is widening in archaeology, partly because of the problem of the long hours. Women that want to have children can't continue in the field work roles. We have a high percentage of young women and a high percentage of older men, which creates a power imbalance, which can be easy to take advantage of, obviously. Joan Giro is a famous archaeologist writing in the 60s about this idea that women work into homework roles. So when we can't stride across fields, being brave and strong, surveying and digging up treasure in ancient islands, we end up sitting at desks, working in offices with more flexible, family-friendly, really, working environments. Rather shamefully, really, none of our contracted organisations has ever undergone an equality audit. We have very patchy gender pay gap reporting as well. And you can see that although 7% of students studying archaeology in the UK are from BAME backgrounds, only 1% of our professional cohort is from that background in London, and we're not representative of the people that we would choose to communicate the results to, really. And finally, of course, all the senior roles in the profession were held by white people in 2015, and I don't think that statistic has improved since. But having said all that, there are positive moves afoot, and I wanted to focus particularly for this event, really, on the importance and value of activism and the provision of safe spaces, mainly online, but also, as I've said, with the Dorothy Garrett example, on Facebook Messenger and things like that. All these networks that are on this slide are volunteer run, mainly by busy women, well, all by busy women who either have kids and or full-time jobs, of course. But this is, as we know, how feminist and other activist networks always have been organised, and we're all honoured to be part of this bigger movement, really. The activism extends now across Europe, and we have colleagues in the US and further afield that we're working on together. It also extends to online. So Trailblazers are a really fantastic group of women who set up to re-edit information out there. Everybody gets their information from Wikipedia these days, so they're providing Wikipedia entries and re-editing entries of early female archaeologists and other women that worked in the earth sciences. And of course, Museum Detox, again, a vital volunteer-led activist group now who are aiming to decolonise museums and archaeology. And this really speaks to the theme I hope I've managed to illustrate, is that there is great value to be had from supportive networks. There are people there in your workplace who are waiting to pick you up and help you further your career or your education. And Museum Detox, for example, have successfully crowdfunded to financially support BAME archaeologists and museum professionals during COVID-19. But the people that help you won't necessarily be the people in charge or the people who sit in HR offices. There'll be people who you might meet through other networks, really. So just to conclude, I know this is a bit painful, but I did want to if anyone wants to read more about this or look, and particularly the YouTube video at the bottom is a really great introduction to the decolonising archaeology debate by one of the Museum Detox volunteers. And although the temptation with all these things is to try and rip it up and start again, actually, it's a pragmatic decision that we've all taken to resist against the status quo really from inside, and try and revolutionise how we work, provide these supportive spaces for women coming now and later. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Sadie. That's a really rich presentation there. And I have to say, I was ignorant to the fact that archaeology sits within construction, but obviously that makes a lot of sense. And especially nowadays with, work, for example, somewhere like the City of London, where obviously that's going to be essential. And so had completely not taken into account all those other issues. Thank you so much. Wonderful to hear about historically and then marrying that up to today. That was great. So next we've got Hannah Swirsky, who's a representative of the Centenary Action Group, who's going to be talking to us about some of their work and campaigns. Thanks, Hannah.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I will just share my screen. There we go. So you should be able to see this. I'll go from here. Yeah, like Amy said, I am the campaign coordinator at the Centenary Action Group. So we are a cross-party coalition of over 100 women's rights organisations, activists and politicians who came together and are continuing to campaign to achieve political representation of women in all our diversity across every level of politics. And we very much work to eradicate the barriers that still exist today, which stop women from being part of the decisions that affect their lives. So we work on trying to improve political participation, ending abuse and violence against women in politics and public life, and also addressing the economic inequalities which prevent women from getting involved in decision making. And here are just some of our wonderful members. And as you can see as well, we're cross-party, so it's kind of a really strong coalition. There's different views within the membership, but it's very much coming together on this issue. So as you can see from these two infographics, women's representation in UK Parliament is still pretty woeful, to be honest. We only have 34% of women who are MPs. That's improvement on 32% before 2019. Fewer than 1% of women MPs identify as disabled, which is completely underrepresentative of society. And I think one of the most shocking things is still to this day, there are no women of colour in the Scottish Parliament, in the Welsh Assembly, or the Northern Ireland Assembly. And you can see just here as well, look at the cabinet. The majority of the cabinet today is white men. And, we have seen when it comes to COVID-19 and the response that the lack of representation is affecting policy making. And, it's so many things go unaddressed. So just first of all, linking to women and work, and thinking of women in politics who are working in politics. One of our kind of early campaigns we were involved in and very much supported was proxy voting. So there's historically and continues to be a motherhood gap when it comes to women, men and women in politics, and this can be to do with the lack of accommodation for caring responsibilities. So in Parliament, unpredictable hours, lack of maternity leave, and several other practices which make it really difficult to juggle both of them. And there was so proxy voting came in. There used to be a system in place called pairing, where if a man or woman was on baby leave or for health reasons they couldn't attend a vote, they would be paired with someone from a different party who wouldn't vote either, and they'd cancel each other out. However, there was, when Jo Swinson was on maternity leave, when she was an MP, a Conservative MP who was paired with her broke the pairing system to vote in a Brexit vote, which was a very close vote, and it just showed how that didn't work. So the proxy voting scheme came in, meaning if you're on maternity or paternity leave, you can nominate another member to vote for you. But actually, we're pushing for this to be widen further. It doesn't, your caring responsibilities don't stop after you come back from maternity or paternity leave, and and there are so many other reasons why both women and men might not be able to be there for a vote. So we've been pushing for other policies, and also for locum MPs. So that was the first time that happened was recently when Stella Creasy was on maternity leave. She actually had a locum MP to come and carry out her constituency work. So that's something that we want to see continue in the future. So, I mean, it's kind of, like abuse against women has always been an issue, and throughout history women have faced abuse for speaking up. Now it's now that we are all working online, this is particularly an issue, and for so many women face online abuse as a kind of an easy way for people hiding behind screens to attack women, and women of colour are disproportionately targeted. So you can see from these stats, I mean, that black women are 84% more likely than white women to be mentioned in abusive or problematic tweets, and also that Diane Abbott received 45% of all abusive tweets sent to female MPs in the lead up to the 2017 general election, and this really highlights how gender intersects with race, religion, LGBT status, amongst other things, and this is a real issue that affects women in politics. At the last election, a number of women actually stood down and said, I don't want to stand again, and they cited online abuse as being one of the main reasons why they didn't want to continue being involved in politics, which we work to try and get more women in, but actually we need to ensure that they can then continue in that job. I'll just go on to harassment in the workplace. So this is an issue that affects all women and also can affect men as well, and 4 out of 5 women who've been sexually assaulted at work do not feel able to report to their employer. So another of our campaigns that we've been doing a lot of work on is calling for a preventative duty on employers to protect women from harassment. And I will link on to how this is linked to women in politics as well in a minute, but it affects all women in the workplace. So we last year we campaigned for the UK to support the adoption of the International Labour Organization Convention 190 on ending violence and harassment at work. So this was a legally binding convention with the aim of ending violence at work, and it is really important because it encompasses it captures many different aspects of the working environment, so work trips, training, social activities and online communications, and really puts the onus on the employers to protect their employees. So this is a picture here from last year when we got loads of people to come together and lobby their MPs in Parliament, called for them to support it at an international level. And the convention was adopted, but now we need to get the UK to ratify it. So it hasn't come into force yet in the UK, and the only 2 countries are Paraguay and Fiji, who have actually ratified this. So this convention is in place, the laws are there, the government just need to get a move on and get it into place. So linking back to women in politics, as I'm sure many of you would have heard, in 2017 many reports came out that both men and women and men reported bullying, sexual harassment, and other forms of violence in the workplace in Parliament, and this is particularly staff working for MPs, and you can see some of the stats here. So there have been several inquiries into this, and Dame Laura Cox, she recommended that there be an independent expert panel to deal with these complaints independently. Now we found out on Monday that Jacob Rees-Mogg was planning to introduce this on Tuesday, which we welcomed, but he wasn't planning to put any safeguards in place which would stop MPs from being able to debate cases in Parliament. Now obviously that would completely stop women from coming forward with the fear that an MP would actually then debate their case publicly, and the old boys network often MPs want to kind of defend each other. So that was a real concern for us. So we kind of rallied lots of people together, and over 60 parliamentary assistants, women's rights organisations and activists all came together to call for there to be this safeguard in place, and we supported an amendment that would make sure MPs could not be involved in this process. So it was very close, but the amendment passed by 5 votes on Tuesday evening, which obviously we were very pleased about, and actually 45 Conservative MPs voted against the government in order to bring this forward. So I think it's really important to recognise this, because not only was this important for us because women working in politics need to be protected, and many were actually leaving politics and leaving Parliament, but also it really sets an example for how sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace should be dealt with, that it should be an independent system and cases should be thoroughly investigated. So yeah, some good news and a step in the right direction. Yeah, that'll end on there.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's great. And I think that if people weren't aware of your work, then hopefully they will support it in the future and the campaigns. I know you've got an amazing website with all the information on there if people want to make themselves more aware or support your work there. So thank you so much. And so last but certainly not least, we've got Rachel, who's the director of the East End Women's Museum, who's going to talk to us about the work that they're doing there. So I will hand over to Rachel, and I'm putting some slides on for you, Rachel, so just give me 1 second.
Yep, fantastic. Thanks very much, Amy. Thanks to you all for joining us, and to my fellow panelists. I think there's some real echoes between what you've said and the things I'm going to talk about, so it's great to see. So yeah, I'm Rachel, the director of the East End Women's Museum. We're a museum dedicated to the powerful stories and diverse voices of the women of East London. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about the museum and how it's really driven by the idea of increasing representation of women, particularly those who've been marginalised through history, why we think that's important, and what is it that we're doing to try to redress that balance. So some of you might know this, but I think it's worth just touching on briefly. Our origin story, which is as unique as it is sort of shocking and sinister, I'm afraid. So we started out 5 years ago in 2015, and that was as a positive protest against the new Jack the Ripper Museum, which is in Whitechapel, and that had been originally purported to be an East End Women's Museum. Of course, when opened, it's centering a man's actions and a brutal serial killer at that. Completely inadequate, sensationalized, not good. And I tell that partly because it shows where it came from, but partly, you know, it's a particularly grotesque example, but I think it's really indicative of how women's voices are so often sidelined, marginalised, overlooked within these historical narratives. So with working women, next slide. So with working women, it can be even starker. When records of women in history are there, as has been said tonight, they inevitably tend to be those with privilege, so perhaps women who mixed in kind of elite circles or had the money to commission something so that we more easily remember their name now. And beyond just that, it seems to me that this kind of traditional lens of historical storytelling, so through these kind of great events, narratives that are around the royal, military, political spheres, it kind of leaves no room for the types of contributions of women that I think have often been more subtle, and certainly more domestic, more collective and gradual. And so, yeah, the narratives just aren't there. And I think it's worth saying that, like, in addition to that, working women are often stigmatised, that they have the double bind of misogyny and class prejudice. They also lack a ready right to reply. And if you just look at the 5 women murdered by the aforementioned serial killer, I won't mention him again, but I think it's a good example. They've only very, very recently been granted the dignity of proper telling of their story by the author Hallie Rubenhold, who's done a wonderful tome. And at the time, in those contemporary Victorian accounts, of course, they were written off as sex workers, as fallen women, as women of bad character, when actually they had much richer lives. They had a diverse range of jobs apart from anything else. So we at the East End Women's Museum think it's vital to redress this balance. Partly because it just gives a more nuanced, rounded view of history, and it starts to bring some kind of justice to the women long dead that otherwise would not have the recognition. But much more than just as a kind of historical phenomenon, it's about the present. So we really strongly see that direct through line between the lack of historical representation and the glass and class ceiling today. So there's that phrase that always sticks in my head, which is, if you can't see it, you can't be it. I think that's so true. It's so limiting. And you know, if we've heard about the issue in our political life, the example that comes to my mind of the FTSE 100 leaders, only 5 of those are women. So that's fewer than people called Dave. So yeah. Not great, and in addition as well, the very stubborn gender pay gap which we know exists. So at the museum we want to facilitate and empower women and girls, both through hearing the stories of other women and through finding their own voice. So they're not feeling a kind of limitation of gender, and they can reach their vast potential. And I should say here, just to clarify, I don't necessarily think that being CEO of a FTSE 100 firm is like the pinnacle of women's possible achievement. In my mind, I would love particularly girls today to completely reimagine what an equitable, patriarchal, capitalist society could look like. But yeah, maybe that's a story for another time. And we also want women and girls to make their mark from a kind of future perspective, so that we are not complicit in perpetuating these cycles and these constraints that mean that voices are missing for future generations of historians. So we want those stories firmly on the record now. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what we do to that end. So for the last 5 years, we've operated as a pop-up. We work all around East London, and we collaborate with different partners from the cultural and charitable spheres, as well as community volunteers. And together we research, record, share and celebrate women's experiences, and then kind of share them with the general public through pop-up exhibitions, through events, through online content. Some specific examples. In 2018, it was a big year for us, as you can imagine, 100 years since some women got the vote, but in addition to that, 50 years since the Ford-Dagenham strikes, so that's a really key story for us. And inspired by this, if you just go back to the previous slide, sorry Amy, this is the top left, you'll see is the kind of introductory panel to the exhibition, which this resulted in. It was called Working for Equality, and alongside an organisation who specialise in oral histories in kind of community settings, they're called Eastside Community Heritage. We trained volunteers to do oral history interviews with women who worked in factories in Barking and Dagenham between 1938 and 1968. And it was such a fascinating process. The women had often not been asked their story at all before, or certainly not formally, and many of them were quite reticent to start with, and it seemed that at least in part that was the sense that that, you know, there's nothing remarkable to say, and of course as they started talking and sharing those memories, they're full of insight and they're completely compelling. So there's a real need to kind of capture these memories before we can't do that anymore. And they were kind of converted into a pop-up exhibition that toured around libraries and community spaces as well as events. And yeah, in terms of the memories, such kind of contemporary resonance. They talked about the second shift. They talked about getting sacked for calling out sexual harassment. They talked about, it's slightly chillingly resonant at the minute, a lack of personal protective equipment and being told, just go buy your own, we can't, there's no more here. So yeah, these are really rich, incredible stories. And of course, one thing that can be really powerful is when local working women's actions result in change at a national or a global level. And we were pleased to mark just last month, it was 50 years since the 1970 Equal Pay Act. Obviously we don't have equal pay yet, but it was still landmark legislation, and it was directly kind of brought about by the 4 Dagenham strikers, the women there. So yeah, we have an online exhibition about that, which I would encourage you to have a look at. Just quickly, some other examples where we've sought to bring out women's stories. Top right there, we went to Watney Market in Shadwell, and we did like vox pops of the women who were shopping and working there about their memories of the market. And an exhibition with Hackney Museum, which I think is, yeah, bottom right, where it was about the long history of women's activism in the Hackney Borough. So we heard about events like the girls' bus strike of 1918, just after the war, where the female bus drivers and conductors went on strike in protest that they didn't get the bonus that the men had got, a successful protest ultimately. And the Hackney Homeworking campaign, which took place in the late 1970s, and that was to organise and agitate for home workers, so largely women, largely from migrant backgrounds, who were doing sort of sewing and machinist work at home for very little pay and without any kind of health and safety protection or regulation. And that resulted in Hackney Council being the first in the country to have a specific person working for them to regulate and monitor and make sure that was more kind of formalised and protected. So just to kind of hopefully end on a high, our journey to telling women's stories continues. So you'll see here, classic building site photo. It does say 2019. You can ignore that. Like all capital projects, it's not on the timeline that they thought it would be when they took this photo. We think it will open in about 2021, late 21, maybe early 22 now, given the current uncertainty. However, what we are doing is setting up as a building for the first time. We're going to be in Barking, and among other great Barking and Dagenham connections, you might know that a young Mary Wollstonecraft lived in Barking, so we have some really nice strong feminist credentials there, and of course very fitting for tonight, being in touch with the crowd here. So yeah, it's an exciting time for us, and we hope for East London women more widely as we tell those stories, and that gives us a kind of home base to have more exhibitions, more learning and engagement programs, work with more community groups, and ultimately to gather and safeguard East London women's voices for generations to come. Thank you. The next slide is just our, there was one more. It's just our website, so it's if you can obviously search it online as well. Is it there? Elusive slide number 8.
I can't find that last slide. Sorry,
Don't
Rachel,
worry.
but I'll put
That's
that.
Okay.
We can put that in the chat.
Perfect. I'll
that people. Yeah, so people can visit it, and obviously when you've got a site as well, that'd be exciting. But I know that having a site has never held you back at the East End Women's Museum, and you've done lots of pop-up events everywhere. Like I saw your wonderful women's hall at Tower Hamlets. archive, which was fantastic, and things like that. So I would encourage everyone to go onto the website there, because there's a breadth of amazing things that the East End Women's Museum do, and I'm sure there would be love some volunteers and voluntary help too, to do some of their many projects. Great. So now we've got some questions. So I'm going to be asking the panelists questions that I directed at them and their particular area of research or experience. But I'm going to ask all of the panelists, if you would like to get involved, if you want to share your thoughts on that too, then you're more than welcome. You could either unmute or you can raise your hand, and that way Liam knows who would also want to speak. So my first question is going to be, they're going to be in order of the panelists that we had. So my first question is for Helen. And Helen, the question is, the conversation around women and work that we have in kind of public memory starts in World War I usually, but your book makes clear that that's really not the case. And I want to ask you, how do you think this affects the way that we think about women and work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's not just World War I think it's both of the world wars actually in the 20th century, which often readily spring to mind when one thinks of sort of the big transformative moments or sort of turning points in women's lives, and perhaps particularly in women's working lives. But you know, and I'm not suggesting that they weren't important moments. There were sort of larger numbers of women, including large numbers of mothers who entered the labour market for the first time and moved into jobs which they hadn't had access to before, particularly skilled engineering work in essential war industries. But of course, and I think what sort of comes across in many of the presentations today is that, you know, women are not newcomers to the labour market. And I think this is the problem when one focuses on these ideas of sort of spectacular moments of mobilisation, such as wartime, when actually women have been present in the industrial workforce since the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, their labour and children's labour were absolutely integral to the process of industrialisation in this country. And they have, you know, that women's paid work is absolutely ordinary, and I think that we do tend to kind of lose that when we focus too much on these sort of particularly kind of spectacular moments like the World Wars. And what's kind of frustrating, I think, as a historian of women, is that actually we've known about these longer histories for a really long time. So it's in the early 20th century that historians like Ivy Pinchbeck, Alice Clark, Dorothy George are writing about women's economic activity, both before and during and after the Industrial Revolution, writing pioneering works of women's history. And then feminist historians from the 1960s and 70s onwards have produced extraordinary scholarship on women's paid labour, stretching right back from, you know, into the medieval period, as well as the classic period of industrialisation. So, you know, it's just frustrating when actually in the sort of the broader public sphere, you know, we don't get those stories across, and you know, that people sort of make a beeline, perhaps particularly the media sort of makes a beeline for these more eye-catching moments like moments of World War. So, you know, this is why it's so important, I think, you know, that particularly academics talk to broader audiences, and also that we have brilliant initiatives like the East End Women's Museum.
That's great. Thank you so much, Helen. Yeah, I agree. And does anyone else want to jump in there? I mean, Rachel, that's very much the work that you do, doesn't it? Especially that particular campaign. Sorry, you remind me of the name that you're working on, which explores the breadth of women's jobs. Yeah,
Working for Equality. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things that we're seeking to do is to kind of flip or challenge those gender stereotypes. And one that kind of calcifies the idea that women have only come into the workforce at times of war. And actually, I think showing the range of jobs and also the vast time period is really critical. So yeah, we would definitely kind of echo Helen's views there.
And I just echo it from an ancient history point of view as well, actually, because it's such a trope that you see I use the word Stone Age, that's not the word that we would use. I was a bit prehistoric man marching off with an animal over his back and a woman at home breastfeeding a baby, and we don't know that was how it was. When we look at the bones of the skeletal evidence of people that have died in the ancient past, we can tell who was doing that kind of work, and it's men and women all the way through. And I think that this assumption that it's divided so on gender lines is actually quite a recent one that archaeologists have partly perpetuated, I have to say. But there's no evidence to suggest that it was like that in the ancient past either.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that, Sadie, because I think you know, for a lot of people that maybe are new to engaging with history as something that's written and biased, and you know, maybe, you know, and myself included here, until I you know, I'd never studied history. I'm new to history. The last time I studied history, I was 13. Now I'm doing a master's in it. But you know, to be able to look at history and then analyze that and say, well, why are they saying that, and why, you know, I think a lot of people, especially with the debates with statues and everything that's going on, you know, might be looking at history in that kind of analytical way, and I think that's a really a big part of when it comes to women's history. Anitha, my next question is for you. Thank you so much for sharing the information and your research on the Grunwick strikes, which is so underplayed when it comes to British Labour history, like you said, and also Black Power movement and all sorts of amazing parts of our history that don't get told often enough. So my question for you is, what was the political context of the Grunwick strikes, and are there similarities to the political climate today? And I'm particularly interested to hear about media representation, you know, especially with social justice campaigns that are going on today. We know that the way that the media represents those campaigns are so important and can have such a big impact.
Thanks for that. It was a very different time in many ways, but there were also many similarities. And the first one that springs to mind is the context of racism. And so if you think about it, early 1970s, late 60s was a period when migrants were coming in, British citizens were coming in from countries in East Africa. And that was about a decade before Grunwick, was when Enoch Powell made his Reverse of Blood speech. And there were high levels of racism towards these British, but not white-skinned immigrants who were coming in. And at that point, the Dock Workers Union marched to the Parliament with banners asking for, in support of Enoch Powell's speech, asking for an end to immigration. And 10 years later, the Grunwick dispute happened. So it happened in a context of heightened racism, but at the Grunwick dispute, that during the demonstrations and rallies in support of the workers, the same Dock Workers Union marched in support of the migrant workers. So I really draw on that as an example of when, in a context of racism, you can mobilize workers to see common cause and to resist the dividing of workers along racial lines. And we see that a similar context today in with the Brexit and the way in which immigration was mobilized and racial differences were mobilized to divide the white working class. And so there is hope, you know, I mean, I hold on to the hope that in that context of divide, there is a possibility for the workers to come together and see common cause with each other and see that their wages are depressed, not because of the new migrants, but because of the structure of capitalism, because of the, you know, rule of state, a whole range of other factors. And media, yeah, you asked me about the media. We have thought a lot about the role of media, and we, in our book, we write about it as well. So during the Grunwick dispute, the media represented the strikers as troublemakers, and they exaggerated violence against the police, they represented violence against the strikers, and we know now from documents that have been released by the archives that there was a whole strategy to the way in which the media did this. And that's something we see again and again of media representation of strikers as troublemakers, as and a focus on the disruption caused by the strike rather than on the causes, you know, the cause of the strikers and the issues that they're struggling for. So I must say on strikes, the British media has largely, by and large, played a very, you know, represented them in a very negative light. And that's a problem because a lot of young people encounter the idea of trade unions and strikes through this prism, through this dominant prism. And we've tried to challenge that through, we did a comic for young people, and I put a link there. And we've tried to challenge that stereotype and that construction and try and get young people to have an insight, a story of strikes which is positive, but which doesn't simplify it by presenting it as just a story of success. It's there are lots of failures as well as success. It's a struggle, yeah. And if things are so easy to change, we would have changed them a long time back. So we're trying to get that story that this is a struggle and the struggle isn't over yet, because lots of young people think, oh, it was terrible in the Victorian times in those industrial factories and we're all very well now. And we're trying to say, no, actually, this is a struggle that has to be continuously played out. And there are lots of defeats as well as victories. And if we don't hold the line, rights that we won over decades, centuries slip away, as we're seeing now. So
thank you, Anitha. Can you just flick through that comic there so we can see some of the pictures, because the artwork is wonderful.
I don't know if it's visible.
You can kind of see the style of it there, and like you said, it's available for free on the website, isn't there? There's copies that you can see there. So
and I also post out copies. So if you go to my work website and email me, I will send you a free copy. And this is the second reprint, and it's been sponsored by Unison Northwest. So yeah. So we're hoping, people will download it, teachers will download it for free. And if anyone wants a printed copy for their library, I'm happy to post it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's a really important part, that message of resilience, the message of keep going, the message that I think, a lot of what we're going through at the moment with the Black Lives Matter is this idea that those struggles are finished, and trying to get the message that they're not. And that leads really well onto my question with Sadie, which explores the Black Lives Matter protest. So there's so much historical engagement going on, which is wonderful when it comes to decolonizing history and things and structures of power. And I want to know from you how archaeologies have been interpreted in the past to pursue this white Western patriarchal view of history.
It's an awesome question, actually. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about it here. I mentioned when I was talking about Dorothy Garrett, her contemporaries, lots of them had been men who had been in the army beforehand, and they come from military background, and that perpetuates up to the sort of 60s post-war period, really. And if you've been in the army, I don't want to judge everybody, but that they came with this mindset that colonizing and winning and fighting and battles were part of a good thing that people could do. So when they studied the Roman period, for example, the Roman conquest of Britain, they decided that it was a positive thing. The Romans civilized the natives, in inverted commas, all that kind of thing. And it fed very much into the colonial, the impression of other types of colonialism that we and other parts of Western Europe had engaged in previously. And it did perpetuate this idea that colonizing was a positive thing, which is really worrying. And the whole structure of archaeology, as I said earlier, is never neutral. It can never be, because the past is not neutral. Depending on who you are and how you think about it, you have a different view. But we were so pleased, mainly overwhelmingly so pleased to see those statues come down, because we constantly lament the lack of engagement with archaeology and heritage amongst normal, in inverted commas, people. And to see them actually taking control over it was awesome. And I think that I really hope that people take more notice of that as an action, and that it does mean that curriculums are decolonized for young kids in school, for universities, and the way that we think about our past is reconsidered, really, because we do live within these systems of oppression that I hate to say it, the senior white academic men have perpetuated for so long.
That's great, Sadie. And do you want to talk about some of the work that you do when it comes to engagement and young people, and maybe trying to challenge some of those dominant views on things?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily structural, as in cross-sector. The universities are all doing their own thing, and we tend to do it from a project sort of basis, really. So if we have a big Roman site in the city, we'll talk about evidence for women, or evidence for slavery, or evidence for multiculturalism in the Roman city. We know that it was a hugely multicultural town. The Romans didn't come from Rome. They didn't come from Italy, most of them. They ended up in London, actually. They came from Germany and North Africa, Belgium, Syria, places that we now know as Syria and Libya, and places like that. So we know that it wasn't a homogenous city. And the narrative that we have to fight against constantly is that that Britain's past is white past. And even that goes back to the really early prehistory, Neolithic, and the Beaker people coming and living in Wiltshire, and people saying that that's an invasion. And it's a constant battle, and it gets heavily confused because DNA science is a really complex thing that not many people, including me, can understand. So you need to be very careful how you interpret that complex science to the general public, and actually archaeologists as well, to be honest. So we take a sort of generalized approach, trying to battle against the media tropes which persist, of course. And people like Mary Beard do an awesome job at that as well, from the classics and from the academic sector.
Yeah, so again, it's this issue with interpretation and historiography and how things, what message comes across. And I think that, you know, as certainly not from an academic or archaeologist point of view, but from someone who's worked in historical engagement for a while, public engagement with things, I think that some people think, or some people maybe use the excuse that, well, it's children and, you know, these things are quite complex. And so you have to kind of sugarcoat it, or you have to do it in a way that's digestible. And I've never struggled to get what some people might consider a complex historical view across to younger children. In fact, I think that they're probably easier than challenging or unlearning some of the things that they've held in their heads before.
Horrible Histories is a perfect example of that, isn't it? I mean, they talk about how grim Roman period was. Nobody wants to live as a Roman ever, because it would have been horrible. But it's and that's part of the interest of it, actually. That in some ways it's glamorous, and they had gold and they rode horses and they had elephants and all that kind of thing. But actually, if you're a normal Roman, it was pretty grim. And kids get that straight away. You're right, they do.
That's great. Thank you, Sadie. So my next question is for Hannah, and it's bringing it again to current events, which is how has COVID-19 affected working women, and what issues has it highlighted that we need to change for a fairer world? I mean, I probably, like most of you, are hoping that things aren't going to go back to normal, and that there are some changes there, and it'd be interesting to hear about what you think about that, Hannah.
Yeah, so COVID has definitely affected women when it comes to work, and you know, while as kind of we recognise that it's been more men who've actually died of the virus, when it comes to economics, it's women who are bearing the brunt of this. And I would really recommend going to Women's Budget Group for more information, because they've done some brilliant research. They're a member of ours. And so, yeah, women hold 70% of jobs that are not entitled to statutory sick pay. And prior to COVID, women did 3 times as much unpaid care as men. I know someone asked a question about that, how it's impacting COVID. It's definitely, it exacerbated the kind of disparity in levels of unpaid care. And some new research came out the other day that showed the proportion of mothers responsible for 90 to 100% of childcare increased from 27% to 45% during lockdown. And you know, and this is, you know, so many women who are meant to be working and holding down full-time jobs while they've got children who, you know, to educate and look after. So that's a massive issue. Also, the you know, women disproportionately work in retail and hospitality, which have obviously been sectors like who've faced the biggest impact. And it's actually young women under 25 who are most likely to be employed by the sectors that have shut down during the crisis. So yeah, I mean, and we've seen, I think, linking a bit more to linking back to why we want more women in politics. When the government announced the support for self-employed people and the kind of furlough finances for self-employed people, they based the amount of money that you'd get off the last 3 years, but they didn't account for the fact that women who had taken maternity leave obviously would have had less earnings during that time. So actually it meant that women who'd taken maternity leave in the last 3 years who were self-employed, they were then going to get less money than normal. And given that the Treasury, 4 out of 5 of the ministers are male, it's just those kind of things that just are not even thought about. So I mean, yeah, I could go on, but there are certainly many things, I think, also around how the social care sector is completely undervalued, and that's majority women who are working in health and social care, you know, on the front of this, is another example of why we really need to invest in those sectors.
Can I just jump in here, because it was really my book was published on the 16th of April, so in lockdown, and I thought, oh shucks, you know what, bad timing. But actually there are all sorts of ways in which the pressures that mothers have been experiencing under the lockdown and during the COVID crisis is so resonant with many of the themes of the book. I mean, particularly the theme of working from home, which is something that actually I've been asked quite a lot about, because home working, and this connects to the Hackney home working campaign that we heard about from Rachel. Actually, paid work in the home is something that mothers have done throughout history, and right through, you know, one thinks of the Industrial Revolution as separating the home from the workplace, but actually paid labour within the home was something which many mothers continue to do in order to earn money for their families. And then, of course, in the later 20th century, it sort of shifted away from industrial homework, although that still exists in some sectors, to a more sort of white-collar telework version where people are sitting with laptops and plugged into the internet. But of course, working from home is often sort of framed as this kind of flexible option, an option that gives women greater autonomy, greater control, they can sort of fit in childcare. But of course, under the conditions of COVID, we don't have any childcare. Well, there hasn't been any childcare. So women have been working at home with children underfoot. And there was just a report in the news today about the massive crisis that's taking place in the childcare sector. And the sector, they've been talking about this ever since the beginning of the lockdown, because they've had massive cut to their income. Many nurseries, it's simply unsustainable for them to operate. And there doesn't seem to be anyone in the government that's actually listening to this, even though billions of pounds are being pumped into all sorts of schemes to keep people in work. And yet the childcare sector is being neglected as far as I can see. And yet, in order to get the economy going again, mothers, parents need childcare. So I think that, you know, that this is a sort of a big issue. And in terms of thinking about whether COVID-19 will change things for the better for women, particularly for working mothers, I'm afraid if we let the childcare sector fall apart, that's not going to happen.
Thanks, Helen. And also, you know, in Double Lives, you talk quite a lot about childcare and how that's changed as well with World War I and things like that. And I thought that was particularly fascinating because, you know, if there's anything that I could be top of my list to reform, it would be childcare and childcare costs and you know, and that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you for that. Right, we are. I've got a question for Rachel, and then I want to make sure that there's room for people to ask questions that are in there, that are attendees as well. So Rachel, the question for you is about the work with the museum, and so how does the museum seek to be intersectional and inclusive in its representation of East End working women, of it being such a broad, lots of stories and narratives to cover there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critically important to us. Being inclusive is one of our kind of intrinsic principles, if you like, of us, the values of the people who work for the museum, as well as the museum as a whole. And it's also kind of practically that there's a recognition that East London is one of the most amazingly diverse parts of the world, and we want to reflect that, and especially centre voices, women from different protected characteristics who otherwise don't always have those kind of platforms or support or kind of mark making, record making to do so. I guess we do that through the choice of stories and the types of work we do, but we also do that through the ways that we work with audiences. And so we, I guess we're a feminist institution and still probably trying to work out exactly what that means for us, but I think it certainly means trying to collapse those hierarchies internally and with our audiences as well, and not sort of replicating the worst of sort of formal hierarchical corporate structures. And that really means co-creative approaches. So I mentioned the Hackney Museum show, where that was really driven by volunteers, local women who lived in Hackney from a diverse range of backgrounds and perspectives, and they chose with kind of facilitated support, chose essentially the theme of the show, the objects, the title. So yeah, we kind of have this, the ways of working that hopefully hopefully enable different voices to shine and that inclusive intersectional approach. We do also have a steering group who are meeting about monthly, and they're kind of helping us shape that new building. They really hold us accountable, which is great. Ask the awkward questions that need asking, and also kind of connect us into diverse different communities, friends, families, networks, as well as, I should say, as working with partners helps us do that, so that we can reach different people and also draw out their stories. And I'll wrap up, but I'd say, you know, the stories are out there. They're not always that well known. One of the things that is lovely is when the historical stories can tell us something in the present about how to be inclusive. You mentioned the Women's Hall show. That was with Tower Hamlets Local History and Archive Service, and we recreated the headquarters of the East London Federation of Suffragettes, who were a much more progressive offshoot of the WSPU, and led by, well, co-founded by Sylvia Pankhurst, and they were particularly concerned with working women's conditions and stories, and that the headquarters that they had in Bow in East London had job opportunities for women. It had childcare, which we were able to put a creche on site with the exhibition, and they also had a cost price restaurant, which again we replicated. So we got redistributed food and sold it for kind of pay what you like type thing. So I just find that such a lovely example of where we can look back to our four sisters to sort of show us the way about being really inclusive.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a great example of history, and I think that's why we're all here and what we all do and what we all hope to achieve with the work that we do, which is, you know, looking at the past, but so that has impact, positive impact for the future. So we're gonna we've got about 10 minutes, so hopefully we can get through the questions from the audience. Liam, I don't know if you have a particular order we're going to do this in.
No, I think, well, you can pick the first one. And then if people want to put up their hands to speak on the microphone, do that now or whenever, and I'll unmute you and we can.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the Mars Quinn, I think I said you'd have your hand up and that you could go next. So Liam, are you going to unmute Mars?
I think Mars is actually gone. Sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Who question in the chat, but she's gone.
Yes. So the first question here I've got is a question for Hannah from Penny, which is online abuse to women in politics. Has any research been carried out as to the gender of those being abusive?
So that's an interesting question. I don't know of any kind of conclusive. I think the thing with online abuse is it is a bit difficult because often it's done by people who are trolls and kind of hiding behind identities, things like that. So you can't always tell the gender of the person perpetrating. I mean, I would say that it's certainly more men who do so. I mean, also when it comes to threats that have resulted in police action, that has been men. There have been several men who have been taken to court and some in prison because of the abuse that they have perpetrated against women MPs. I mean, only was it a year or 2 years ago, police managed to stop there was a murder plot against a Labour MP, and obviously we know of the tragic murder of Jo Cox MP as well. So, and I mean, also there's often women MPs often get rape threats as well, so that's a really common occurrence. So I mean, I can't offer too much evidence to substantiate that directly because it is difficult, but I mean, it certainly is more men than women.
Thank you, Hannah. And we've got here an interesting question, which I think could be answered by anyone here who wants to chip in, which is from Julie, who asks, she says, feminism in society today has negative connotations attached to it, and it seems that the concept of feminism is moving away from its origin. How can we raise awareness about the development of feminism and the importance of change and move away from today's negative connotations. So that's a question from Julie. How can we raise awareness about the development of feminism and the importance of change and move away from today's negative connotations?
Can I start on this?
Of course.
So I think there's two types of dominant attitudes towards the history of feminism. On one hand, there are those who think that feminist struggles had a place in history, and that inequality was a thing that happened a long time back. And so there's positive representations of suffragettes, and that we don't need that anymore because we've achieved equality. And this is the post-feminist perspective, the idea that we're in an equal world now, and therefore it had its place in the past, we don't need it anymore. And that is quite problematic, because what it does is it ignores the huge inequalities that exist today. And often what happens with this is there's a presentation, or there's the idea that women today, or women in the West today, have all these choices in front of them, and the only women who are oppressed are women who are from other parts of the world, these or migrant women within the West, and they are the ones who need feminism, or they are the ones who need to struggle for equality. Everyone else is equal. And then there are also those who, and in this context, those who identify as feminists are seen as regressive, or that they are ignoring the achievements of women. And so a lot of negative representation of feminism comes from this idea that equality has been achieved for white women in the West. And I think that's quite problematic. And so we need to unpick it. So even the division of household labor during COVID. So there's all these stories that we still need to tell, because and this fits within the idea of neoliberalism, the idea that we are agents and we have choices. So there's a reluctance to recognize how we are constrained. And so when I look at my daughter, who thankfully isn't here, so and she won't see this discussion. So when I see the WhatsApp or the social media pictures that she and other young girls, she's a teenager, exchange, all of them have this strange pout. And it's all the women, the girls who are doing that. The boys clearly aren't doing it. And yet if I talk to her about it, she says, oh, it's my choice. I'm going to do have my face whatever I want to. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. It's your choice. But have you thought about why all these girls are making the same choices? And so we need to think more about what are the contexts in which our choices are shaped, and what are the constraints that shape our choices. So there's a reluctance to engage with that, because we like to see ourselves as free agents. So
that's so interesting. Thank you, Anitha. Helen, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I was going to kind of challenge the premise of the question, because I remember the 1990s when I was a teenager, and there was a huge amount of hostility towards feminism in the 1990s. That was the era of post-feminism, and I remember running for women's officer at my university, my college in Cambridge. And I remember sort of like in my talks, and this would have been in about 2000, and in my talk I said, I'm a feminist, and I kind of got booed at this point. And there was a lot of, whataboutery from the men, and someone said, I'm going to stand for men's officer, and so on. And it felt a very kind of toxic, hostile environment back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And in a way, I think young women are actually more politicized and more willing to embrace feminism in some respects now than they were when I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s. If you think about the Me Too movement, I think has been massively mobilizing moment. I think about the Women's March, which I took my children on. I didn't think had to drag them screaming and kicking, but my two daughters came with me. I do think that there are possibly sort of more uncomfortable questions and debates within feminism, particularly around the trans issue. And I think that has created a lot of division and difficulty within feminism. But I do think that there's been sort of something going on under the surface, and maybe it is a kind of reaction to neoliberalism that somehow galvanized young women. And perhaps it's also something to do with millennials feeling that they'll never be able to get secure jobs or buy houses. And there's a kind of generational kind of momentum and power behind some of this. But I, take on board everything that was said, about also not being very careful not to look at this purely from a Western perspective.
Thank you. We have Carol, I think, who's going to ask a question because we're running out of time a little bit. So I think we've got time to ask Carol's question. Is Carol going to ask it herself, Liam?
I think so. I'll just unmute her and if she wants to.
That would be great.
Okay, Carol, are you there?
Hi, Carol.
Hello, everyone. And there are so many points about Reform House, Mary MacArthur and Grunwick's, which I remember I was a teenager, just in my first job at a trade union when that started. So I'm really interested in that. I'm going to have to dump all that. Oh, quick plug for my book, which is Women at War in World War II, 2 volumes. And one of the things...
Please put a link in the chat, Carol, so we can all go and have a look at that.
Yes, I will. The thing I suppose it really comes down to is how do we measure change? Do we understand how change happens? Because I think one of the things that's been really fascinating to me was that if I think about the women I interviewed for the Women at Work in World War II, one of the things that really came across to me was that this was a massive, massive change in the lives of everyone, to see women in all sorts of jobs, things they didn't think they could do, and suddenly they were massively capable, etc. And then, of course, the deal was they went back. But one of the things that really also came across was that even amongst those who didn't want to carry on working and stuff, the experience meant that there was no political movement in the post-war era to get women in work, to give them equal pay and all that kind of stuff. But when you got to the conversations in the 60s and 70s, you had this whole generation of women, say that, well, at least judging by the ones I interviewed, who said, well, I experienced it. And it wasn't about whether I was male or female that made me a good worker, that meant, I should be paid less. It was, I think, a third less on average than men. And it was almost like that political movement came along much later, but you had to have that personal experience in those conversations. And I wonder now about one of the things that I think is really interesting now is we're looking very differently and very quickly at particularly, say, women in the care sector, women in the NHS. We're looking at BAME people and saying, right, people who are typically on low paid jobs in very, very vulnerable places. And suddenly we're having conversations that are very different. I'm not saying the racism has gone away, but if I think about the conversations we're having now about people in that sector compared to, say, Grunwick, which I remember being presented as just brutally racist in terms of the Evening Standard coverage, the newspaper coverage, the conversation on television. It seems we kind of moved along a bit. And I suppose this is a very muddled question, sorry, but I suppose it's how do you see the change that's happening as being real? Or will it be, as I often think, you go 2 steps forward and 1 step back? So you kind of, that's a succinct version, if that makes any sense. Oh, hold on.
I don't know if anyone in particular wants to answer that question. I mean, I think, Carol, actually, personally, what I've taken away from this, although there's been a lot of awful, especially, Hannah, you were talking about, the impact on women and working women and mothers and things like that, it has given me a little bit of hope too. I mean, with Sadie's work, with her last slide there about, people coming together and, and Anitha, when you were talking again about perhaps there is a kind of petri dish happening, which was similar to the circumstances with the Grunwick strike, where young people, especially Hannah, when you said it was like young people under 25 that are being disproportionately affected in the care sector, in hospitality and things like this, perhaps it's creating the right kind of conditions for the kind of positive change that we're looking for. But that's just my wishful thinking. Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian. My sort of trade is trying to explain change and continuity over time. So, I mean, this is, the killer question. How does change happen? Why does it happen when it does happen? And we can think about very kind of long-term structural shifts. I mean, I think about this quite a lot in my book, because there is a big shift around the middle of the 20th century, particularly the 1950s and 60s, when women's workforce participation goes up, and then it keeps going up. And a lot of this is being driven by higher participation rates for wives and mothers. And, you know, so there's a question, well, why does this happen at this moment? And of course, one can think about the impact of the Second World War in changing women's aspirations or perhaps public attitudes about what women are capable of. But then, as you pointed out, Carol, actually it's not straightforward, because in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, women were demobilised and they were pushed back into the feminised sectors of the economy, and many women actually withdrew from the labour market altogether to get married, to start families, or to go back to the families that they already had. But what does happen in the middle of the 20th century are demographic shifts, long-term demographic shifts, reductions in family size. Women are in better health, partly because of the NHS, partly because of better diets, and partly because they're not pregnant as much during their life course. And also there are these economic shifts where by the 1950s, the economy is booming and there aren't enough unmarried single women or full-time male workers to do all the jobs that the employers need to fill, and so they have to start recruiting married women's work. So there's a demand in the economy for married women's labour. So, you know, all of these things sort of come together around the middle of the 20th century and then sort of bring about this shift that then continues, this trend that then continues right up to the present day. Now it's something like 75% of mothers of dependent children are in the workforce. But I think it's, you know, it's totally fascinating to think of this question, you know, why did women suddenly become politicized in the late 60s, early 70s? You know, why does women's liberation come then, when so many of the contradictions in women's situation have been, you know, patently obvious throughout the 1950s and early 1960s? So why is there a new analysis or a new framework for thinking about inequality, for thinking about sexual divisions? Why do we suddenly have this extraordinary intellectual fireworks that comes, and activism which comes with second wave feminism? So, you know, these are really, really important questions, and this is why history is so important and so fascinating.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I think on that note, we will end there. And thank you so much to everyone who's taken part in this today. And thank you for everyone for attending too. And this is going to get recorded and it will be put on YouTube so that other people can watch it who couldn't make it today, can watch it too in the future. So thank you so much for your contributions and your time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks for great presentations.
Thank you, Jack.